What would happen if they opened the doors and let these men out? Tonight, what happened when they did. Great Falls, Montana. A man is arrested lurking around this elementary school. Now police say he was a real-life Hannibal Lecter. Near Boston, a convicted rapist murders 2 young women. Therapists thought he was no longer dangerous.
After Michael Kelly was released, did you go to his home for a party?
I won't speak any further about Michael Kelly.
This was at the point when Michael Kelly had buried one of the young women in his backyard.
Why were dozens of dangerous men released back into neighborhoods like yours? How many are still loose? Where are they tonight?
From ABC News, this is Primetime Thursday with Diane Sawyer and Charles Gibson. Tonight, a primetime investigation. Predators among us. Primetime continues after this brief message.
I don't want to go jogging.
Gibson.
Good evening, and welcome to another edition of Primetime Thursday.
We started investigating tonight's story more than 4 months ago in Montana. The story of a sexual predator named Nathaniel Barjona. Montana accused him of crimes that shocked the world. But we learned that long before he came to Montana, Barjona had committed crimes that could have, maybe should have, locked him up for life. Tonight, something every man, every woman, every parent should hear as we investigate a system that not only put Barjona back on the streets, but dozens of others who were released from the same treatment center at about the same time. Cynthia McFadden with The Predators Among Us.
It's just a week or so before Christmas in 1999. On 3 different days, police see a man lurking around this elementary school in Great Falls, Montana. When they arrest him, they discover he's carrying a stun gun, a fake police badge, and pepper spray. They charge him with impersonating an officer.
He was like the guy next door that, that you would trust, until you really got to know him.
Deborah Champagne and her son Lucas thought they knew the man who was arrested, Nathaniel Barjona, their neighbor, a frequent visitor at their home, and a popular figure at Saturday swap meets.
And the kids, they always went to Nate's booth first because he always focused on children's things, that mostly what little boys liked.
Barjona had lots of little boys as friends. He sold them toys out of his garage. But Deborah Champagne started to get an uneasy feeling when Barjona would come over to visit.
I would go, to the restroom or something at the apartment, and all of a sudden he'd have Lucas coaxed into his bedroom. And I'd be like, what are you doing in here?
And what was he doing in Great Falls? That was a question a whole town would ask as the puzzle of Barjona's secret life was put together piece by piece. In 1996, 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey had disappeared. Witnesses say he was last seen in this alley with Barjona. But the investigation had gone nowhere until the day Barjona was arrested outside that school. When police searched Barjona's house, they found a chilling list of children's names. Among them, Zachary's. And in the garage, as they sifted through the dirt and debris, police say they found the bones of a different child. And this, a journal written in code. According to the FBI, which deciphered it, it's a cannibalistic menu of sorts, with such gruesome entries as little boy stew and roasted child. Police charge Barjona with Zachary's murder. They say he butchered the boy, then tried to serve the remains to Deborah Champagne. He called it venison stew.
I was like, this is spoiled venison. He's like, oh no, I did it myself. And I'm like, oh no, we're not eating it. And now, and then he got mad and left.
The people of Great Falls were shocked. Could a real-life Hannibal Lecter be living among them? They were equally shocked by how he got here. Prosecutor Brant Light says Barjona was dumped on Montana by officials in Massachusetts without even a warning.
I've been waiting now for over a year and a half for somebody to call me up and say, hey, we're sorry, we made a mistake, and here's what we've done to correct it, to make sure it doesn't happen again.
What had happened, and what did they know in Massachusetts about Barjona? We followed his trail from Montana east. It took us to this place, the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous, where predators can be locked away for life. Barjona spent 12 years behind these fences for crimes against little boys. Then, in 1991, he was set free. When we started to dig, we learned many others had been set free at the same time. In fact, many the very same year, 1991. Convicted rapist Michael Kelly got out and murdered 2 women. Ronald Leftwich got out and murdered a priest. Ralph Houghton got out the year before and raped a retarded 21-year-old man. And Wayne Chapman, a serial pedophile, we'll tell you more about him later. So what was going on here? The treatment center was set up in the 1950s as a way to lock up sex offenders, possibly for life. Sean Summers was a caseworker there for 6 years.
It was a warehouse for dangerous people. We need a warehouse for really dangerous people so they don't go out and kill other people or hurt kids. But it was a big hypocrisy.
Things changed when the court said it had to be run more like a hospital than a prison, but treating the men like patients, not prisoners, didn't work.
It was like being in there with Satan.
This man is a convicted rapist who was an inmate in the treatment center for 12 years.
They didn't separate those who raped adults from those who raped children, or gays from straights. So anything went.
We've heard reports of inmate-on-inmate sex.
Common.
Discouraged by the staff?
And not at all.
Because?
Mental health community generally thought that that was fine, well, and good, and asked about your relationship because it was consensual.
Were the therapists aware that the prisoners were having sex with each other?
Well, the therapists were having sex with the so-called patient inmates as well.
There's no doubt in your mind about this?
There's no doubt in my mind about it at all, because I was approached a couple of times.
Inmate-staff relationships?
There were occasions when that happened.
It wasn't condoned, but that's not all that was happening. Outsiders were actually brought into the mix. For several years, the treatment center sponsored a family visitor day, billed as a way to facilitate rehabilitation. Insiders tell us that several of the inmates were caught having sex with their visitors, but when someone noticed one of the pedophiles was running the children's pony rides, and yet another was accused of trying to molest someone else's niece, Visitors Day was finally canceled. And so, in this environment, Nathaniel Barjona was supposed to be getting better. Former therapist Paula Erickson knew how dangerous Barjona could be from another inmate.
We had been in group with Nathaniel Barjona.
What did he tell you?
He told me that he had cannibalistic tendencies.
He would go to therapy so they couldn't say he was not participating, and he would sit there and just laugh.
From the time Barjona was first evaluated, therapists documented his problems. 1977, he's called dangerously disturbed and his recovery questionable. 1980, he has sexual fantasies about torture and cannibalism. He expresses a curiosity about the taste of human flesh. 1983, Barjona admits a long-standing interest in the instruments of torture. Other inmates say they knew of Barjona's fascination with makeshift kiddie porn.
They would get catalogs, like Sears catalogs, and they would open them up and take scissors and cut out pictures of, you know, a child maybe modeling underwear or something.
And where do they say he hid it?
He used to carry it around in his Bible.
A Bible he was seldom without. Barjona was a member of a Christian group inside the institution.
It attracted mostly pedophiles. They used that as a substitute for therapy. We're in the church. We're studying Jesus. We're sorry we did this, and we're going to confess to God, and we're going to be all set.
But despite all this, Barjona still had a chance to get out. This is how it works. Inmates have the right each year to petition a judge to release them. To stop that, the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the inmate is still dangerous. Back then, it was no secret among inmates that the best way to get out was to find 2 sympathetic psychologists. Barjona did just that. He found 2 men who identify themselves as Christian psychologists, Dr. Richard Ober, a family therapist, and Dr. Eric Schweitzer, who runs a Christian counseling center. I'm Cynthia McFadden from ABC News. You'd be willing to talk to us?
I really can.
You can or you won't.
Both refused to speak with us, but when we caught up with Dr. Schweitzer, he finally agreed to talk.
Do you think you can predict who's going to be dangerous and who isn't?
No.
Not with any high-level certainty.
Yet, back then, Dr. Schweitzer and Dr. Ober both testified before the judge that Barjona was not now a sexually dangerous person. The treatment center argued against his release, calling him a risk to the community. But the judge accepted Drs. Ober and Schweitzer's recommendation. And
he's duped a lot of us. There were strong enough statements apparently made by him or supposedly made by him, and if had I been aware of them, probably those in themselves would have caused me not to recommend his release. But apparently it was data.
He talked about eating children.
Correct.
He talked about the instruments of torture in
Right.
group therapy. He talked about his fantasies of...
And if those were in the record, Cynthia, I never saw them.
And on the very day he was released, new questions about Barjona's state of mind.
On the day that he left, his mother came to the institution to pick him up. And as he was leaving the institution, he mooned a female correction officer. And as they were leaving, his mother slapped him in the face.
Within days, yet another warning. He was arrested. Police say he got into a parked car and sat on a little boy's lap while the boy's mother was inside this post office. But Massachusetts offered him a deal. If he'd leave the state with his mother, who was moving to Montana, the charges would be dropped. Montana prosecutor Brant Light.
They simply, basically said to go Montana, good luck. That to me is, I just can't believe they did that.
In Montana, Barjona is now charged with molesting 3 boys and with first-degree murder in the death of the little boy he allegedly cannibalized. He faces the death penalty. He's pled not guilty.
Do you feel you owe anyone an apology for your recommendation?
No, I don't. I'm clear on my conscience before God.
It's not very comforting to the parents of the little boy that he allegedly cannibalized.
I'm sure that's true.
Within a month of Barjona's release, the same 2 psychologists, Drs. Ober and Schweitzer, would recommend the release of yet another man, a man who was at the treatment center for molesting more than 50 boys, a man with the same MO for stalking children as Barjona, right down to the police badge and the stun gun. His name? Wayne Chapman.
He was not very bright, but when it came to stalking children, he was a wizard.
When we return, he recorded his twisted thoughts as he prowled the Northeast looking for children.
Boy, would I love to get into some of the stuff that's in them buses. Wow.
A child molester who may be back on the streets soon. Primetime Thursday, brought to you by Nexium. Talk to your doctor about prescription Nexium. BC. Predators Among Us continues. And now, Charles Gibson.
We continue now with another story from the Massachusetts Center for the Treatment of the Sexually Dangerous. Sex crimes prosecutors know a grim reality, that sexual predators victimize far more people than we ever know about. One study found pedophiles on average molest 75 children before they're caught. The next man you'll meet is admitted to attacking dozens and dozens of children. Once again, Cynthia McFadden.
It was grisly work, running the incinerators at this Providence hospital each night, burning the medical waste. But it was Wayne Chapman's daytime occupation that caught the attention of police.
Here comes 2 boys now. One of them looked pretty good there. Ooh.
This is very difficult to listen to. The voice of a pedophile recorded himself as he stalked little boys.
There's several school buses passing me now. Boy, would I love to get into some of the stuff that's in them buses. Wow. Woo.
This is the man behind the voice, Wayne Chapman. We are broadcasting this so you might get a glimpse into the mind of this predator.
Right now I'm passing 2 paper boys. One of them's about 8 years old.
He made the tapes, presumably, so he could relive the experience later. He admitted that for years he traveled all over the Northeast looking for boys.
It's out of this world, the feeling you get from a young kid like that.
As he stalked children, he took these pictures. Police say they were potential victims. And he didn't just photograph the boys. In Providence, he admits he ran a club for boys and molested some of the members.
What Wayne Chapman did to him, it was horrible. Horrible.
This man, seen here in a photograph that Chapman took of him when he was just 10 years old, says Chapman tried to molest him and succeeded in molesting his best friend.
It took away his childhood, his innocence. He doesn't trust anyone, medication after medication. If you look at him, he's kind of empty inside. I can stop.
He says Chapman molested boys at this apartment, where he set up cameras, tripods, and even a darkroom.
He preyed on the kids that were really weak and that were looking for attention.
Chapman's crimes came to light almost by accident. In 1976, Chapman was stopped in the pre-dawn for a routine traffic violation. Police found hundreds of pictures of naked boys in his van.
He didn't go fishing, he didn't go hunting, he didn't play golf, he didn't do anything that normal people do. His whole thing was being around children.
Al Mintz was a sex crimes detective in Providence at the time. For some reason, he was the only cop Chapman would talk to.
Tell me what your first impressions of Wayne Chapman were.
The best way to describe that is that I was looking into a black hole.
What did he admit to you?
The first thing he admitted was molesting a lot of children, tying children, leaving them in the woods. I went through his trash. I found receipts, gasoline receipt, restaurant receipts. They could place him in different towns. And isn't that funny? Whenever we checked with us, there was a murder or a sexual assault or a body found.
Or a missing kid.
Or a missing child.
In Brockton, Massachusetts, Chapman was charged with the murder of a 5-year-old boy. The charges were dropped for lack of evidence. One reason, the body had not been recovered. That same year, Chapman was also a suspect in the possible murder of a 10-year-old boy who disappeared from this pool in nearby Lawrence. The case remains unsolved.
He described the exact area where he disappeared. He described the city yard, sand piles and asphalt, which was near the pool. When we kept questioning him, he blurted out, "Okay, I killed the kid, okay?"
But authorities never pursued a murder case, and at the time, that was okay with Detective Mintz, because Chapman was sent to the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous for 2 other sex crimes. He figured that's where Chapman would stay.
The state of Massachusetts had that law that once he was deemed a sexually dangerous person, that he would go away forever.
You believe Wayne Chapman would never get out of this state hospital?
That's what I was told, yes.
And at the time, it seemed like the truth. He would never get out as long as therapists continued to see him as sexually dangerous.
We had great concerns about Wayne Chapman.
Paula Erickson was one of his therapists. She was laid off in 1992 and has since settled a lawsuit she filed against the state.
He was one of the church people. He was forever talking about religion and refusing to do treatment.
Remember, like Barjona, religion became a preoccupation for Chapman in the treatment center.
He wouldn't participate in treatment unless it was his way. And his way was this Bible talk. And that's all he was interested in.
Chapman did participate in some treatment. Remember Dr. Schweitzer, who recommended Barjona's release? Wayne Chapman hired him as his therapist. And Dr. Schweitzer and Ober, the 2 men who helped Barjona get out, were about to do the same for Wayne Chapman. Ober wrote, Chapman has undergone a religious experience, and noting that on visiting day, he is exposed to children who are present, but has had no sexual thoughts regarding them. The state said Chapman was sexually dangerous, but had shown improvement. The treatment center fought Chapman's release, but the question is, how effective was their argument? Not only in his case, but in dozens of others. Because at the time, a state report had concluded that the treatment wasn't working.
There wasn't anything to show that the various treatment modalities that had been used at the treatment center, either in Massachusetts or in other places, really had any long-term effect in actually changing behavior.
Attorney Bruce Carroll has represented more than 24 inmates who gained release from the treatment center. He says the center's poor reputation made his cases easier to win.
A judge could sort of look and sort of say, you know, if the treatment center isn't doing their job right, how can I believe what they're saying here in the courtroom?
In Wayne Chapman's case, the judge sided with Chapman's hired psychologist, relying heavily on the opinion of Dr. Ober, much to the chagrin of Detective Mintz.
He says in his 1990 report that Wayne Chapman, quote, has no record of any injury to his victims.
That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. The first time he went to jail, he tied a child to a tree and set him on fire. This doctor, what did you say his name was? Ober?
Dr. Ober.
Never talked to me.
Dr. Ober would never agree to talk to us, either. So what could have been a life sentence for Wayne Chapman wasn't. Instead, he now only has to finish his original prison term. He is scheduled for release in 3 years.
Detective, do you believe that if Wayne Chapman is released, he'll engage in these activities again?
Absolutely. It's just a matter of time.
Next, a rapist's special privileges, let loose from the center for days at a time, and finally set free, only to kill.
My sister was a victim, and not only a victim of Michael Kelly, but a victim of a failure of the system.
The man they called the model inmate, when primetime returns. Inmates allowed to roam free in the community, even to pick up prostitutes, and their therapists didn't seem to mind.
The therapeutic community would consider that a step in the right direction because it was an adult, it was consensual, and good for him.
Predators Among Us, when Primetime Thursday continues after this from our ABC stations.
You'll find
A primetime investigation, Predators Among Us, continues. Once again, Diane Sawyer.
The Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous is one of the largest of its kind in the world. 500 men are held there. By law, every year, each of them can ask to be released, and it's then up to the state to prove that the man is still dangerous. The court relies heavily on psychologists, but studies show that even under the best of circumstances, they're wrong a substantial portion of the time. Cynthia McFadden continues now with a man who appeared to be an ideal candidate for release.
This is Michael Kelly. He was committed to the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous after convictions for 2 brutal rapes. 11 years later, he was released. Once again, it is 1991. The Department of Mental Health finds Kelly a job at this sign shop. And right next door, the same department places 21-year-old Colleen Coughlin, a disabled woman, in her first apartment. Days later, she vanishes without a trace.
Awful. Just awful.
Her grandmother, Norma Jean Coughlin.
No matter how old they are, she still was missing. We didn't know where she was, regardless of whether she's 5 years old or 21 or 29. The same feeling is there.
3 months go by, but nobody thinks to question Kelly until a second woman, Deborah Lavangi, disappears in the same neighborhood. After police find her body in the sign shop where Kelly works, he admits to murdering both women. He takes police to his home where Colleen Coughlin's body is buried in his backyard.
This is a crime somebody let happen. She was just an innocent girl, young girl. That's all. And he was let out there to go after a young, innocent girl. And it happened to be Colleen.
My sister was a victim, and not only a victim of Michael Kelly, but a victim of a failure of the system, basically.
Bree Coughlin and her family want to know why Kelly was released when he could have been held for life.
You tried to stop Michael Kelly's release.
I did try to stop his release.
Former therapist Paula Erickson was a member of the review board that recommended Kelly's release, although she voted against it.
Why was Michael Kelly released?
He was released because he was Dr. Franke's pet, and it would just be impossible for Michael Kelly to not be anything but okay. And he was released because he said what they wanted to hear.
Dr. Robert Prenke is the treatment center's director of research. He was also one of Kelly's therapists.
How well did you know Michael Kelly?
This is not something I can talk about.
Because?
Let's go off camera.
At first, Dr. Pranke didn't want to talk about Michael Kelly or his work with him, but he was willing to talk about his research into predicting which sexual predators are likely to strike again.
The very finest, the most skilled, the most seasoned forensic examiners will still be fooled by the most skilled, the most seasoned, the brightest and the most talented psychopaths.
But it's worth taking a chance.
Do we have any choice?
Dr. Pranke says no. He believes treatment can work in some cases, and when it does, those men need to be released. But even he acknowledges knowing for certain is impossible.
Cynthia, there will always, always be failures. Look, the best that we can hope for is achieving an overall accuracy of about 80%. That means that we're still going to be wrong as much as 20% of the time.
But consider the implications of even that most optimistic of estimates. Then consider this. In the late 80s and early 90s, even though the treatment center opposed most releases, there was a virtual exodus of inmates.
It was like a nuclear power plant just dumping nuclear waste on the community.
It was a time when even the federal government bought into the idea that sex offenders were different from other criminals. They had a disease. Even the Social Security Administration considered the conditions underlying pedophilia a disability, and believe it or not, were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars to pedophiles inside the treatment center for their disability.
Practically everybody was getting Social Security checks except me.
Some of these guys were getting a lot of money.
Oh, yes. There's people that were walking around there with $3,000 and $4,000 in cash in their pockets.
Sean Summer, the caseworker, saw firsthand what was going on.
I used to take patients/inmates to the administrative area where they would pick up checks. I saw retroactive Social Security checks in the amounts of $13,000, $20,000, a lot of money.
All the money created a flourishing underground economy, complete with allegations of extortion and money laundering. And the canteen was a hub of activity. And who ran the canteen? For a while, it was Michael Kelly, though he denies any wrongdoing.
The canteen seemed to have everything but women and children in there that you could buy.
Like what could you buy in the canteen?
You could buy drugs and anything else you can imagine.
This was in one inmate's room.
I want a stereo, a TV,
anything. I've seen stereos the size of that table. TVs, yeah. You could have anything you want come in there.
The Social Security Administration acknowledges to prime time that some pedophiles at the treatment center received checks for decades, right up until last year. Flush with disability checks, inmates from inside the treatment center were making big purchases on the outside, too. Like this house, which several years ago was owned by a child molester. And this house, which was actually rented to treatment center staffers by its then owner, another child molester.
A lot of times their only disability was a proclivity to put little boys' heads in vices. Now, we were paying these guys for that service.
with the help of their therapists who
oftentimes help them fill out the applications. How can you justify giving those guys Social Security monies? Terrible.
Terrible, but all part of the world Michael Kelly knew at the treatment center. Even though he wasn't getting Social Security checks, remember, he did get favored jobs, like running the canteen.
I don't know any special privileges that this man was given that other inmates were not given.
No? Consider this. Michael Kelly was one of only a handful of men actually allowed to leave the institution and roam the streets unsupervised for days at a time. When we come back, what Michael Kelly did with his freedom.
I'm every man.
And every woman who ever suffered from frequent, persistent heartburn.
If you've treated your heartburn and changed your diet, but the pain...
Kmart, Fred Meyer, Lowe's Home Centers, and participating True Value.
Prime Time continues. Once again, Charles Gibson.
We return now to the Massachusetts Treatment Center and more on the story of Michael Kelly, the man who insiders say really knew how to work the system. Here again, Cynthia McFadden.
Inside the treatment center, two-time rapist Michael Kelly was on the fast track to his eventual release. The only inmate treated personally by Dr. Robert Prenke, the treatment center's director of research.
There are numerous sources who have told us that their perception is Michael Kelly was your pet patient and that you were determined to show that treatment worked.
I can tell you categorically that that's nonsense.
But Michael Kelly says the staff did treat him differently.
I was everybody's supposed to boy. I was the star I was supposed to be. Yeah. And I felt, boy did I fall.
Kelly allowed us to tape record a conversation with him in the prison where he is now serving life.
Everything was politics. It wasn't really about who was getting the proper treatment. It's who looked good. You had to present a good package.
These guys become tremendous amateur psychiatrists. They know the lingo.
Sean Summer, one of Kelly's caseworkers, says Kelly was actually preparing the ultimate con.
A model patient who cried when he was supposed to, talked about his issues, got the appropriate support from the mental health staff, and played the game.
Played the game so well, he received the rarest of privileges. Shockingly, Kelly was allowed to roam through these neighborhoods unsupervised for days at a time, even overnight. He had so much freedom, he actually created a parallel life on the outside. Somehow, while still an inmate, he managed to buy this house and even start a family.
Yeah, I took Michael home. I took him to visit his new wife.
New wife?
Yeah, he got married while he was in the facility. So we took him to visit his new bride.
The man who's convicted of rape, who is committed to an institution where he's supposed to be receiving treatment, has a wife on the outside, a home on the outside, and gets to go there, I think is going to shock a lot of people.
It should shock a lot of people. It should. He was having a ball.
And he wasn't the only one. The community release program was run out of this building. And records show over 10 years, one pedophile had 1,700 unescorted visits into the community. Another inmate, a cross-dresser, was arrested downtown for shoplifting women's clothes. Sean Summers says some inmates, including a pedophile he was supervising, hired prostitutes while outside.
Being a pedophile, the therapeutic community would consider that a step in the right direction because it was an adult, it was consensual, and good for him. That would be the rationale for that.
The man Sean Summers was supervising was released, and a few months later slit the throat of a teenage boy. The pedophile had become a murderer. As for Michael Kelly,
the 11 years of treatment turned him into a murderer in addition to a rapist.
Attorney Rachel Prindle sued the state on behalf of the family of Kelly's victim, 21-year-old Colleen Coughlin.
The heart of the allegations against the state are that there was a lot of corruption going on at the facility, including trafficking in drugs, money laundering, hundreds of thousands of dollars of Social Security checks, and that Michael Kelly knew about it, and that the staff sort of gave him his walking papers so that he wouldn't implicate anybody.
Prindle went through thousands of confidential documents to make her case, a case the state settled without admitting liability. But Dr. Prenke says the allegations were baseless.
Utter nonsense. It is simply not enough to hear that it was human error, that there was no conspiracy, that there was no deep, dark, sinister motive. It's hard to accept that it was simply human error.
Do you feel he fooled you?
Yes, he fooled me. Yes, I made a mistake. I made a tragic mistake, as we all have.
And he wasn't alone. A review board, which he was not on, recommended Kelly's release, despite what happened just before he got out.
3 weeks before the vote to determine whether he was still sexually dangerous, he was found with a 14-inch carving knife, barber scissors, rope, money, credit cards, while he was out on his community release program.
In other words, she says he was out loose in the community with what she calls a rapist toolkit. And yet, astonishingly, the man who had been sentenced to the center for 2 brutal rapes in the first place was still recommended for release. Officials there bought his explanation that the knife was just an innocent kitchen utensil. And now, even Kelly says his release was a big mistake.
I'm not releasable now. There's no way I could be dead.
But belief in Michael Kelly ran deep. Kelly told us that Dr. Prenke actually attended a party at his house.
After Michael Kelly was released, did you go to his home for a party?
I won't speak any further about Michael Kelly.
This was at the point when Michael Kelly had buried one of the young women in his backyard.
As I said, I won't comment any further about Kelly.
What Dr. Prenke will say is that Kelly's crimes deeply affected him.
I came very close to dropping out, to stopping working with sex offenders at that point. Came very close.
And Kelly?
This is where I'm going to be, and this is where I belong.
He now has a real-life sentence, incarcerated this time in prison.
You have anything to say on it?
Coming up next, how many other dangerous men were let out of the treatment center, and where are they tonight? Then after our program at abcnews.com, learn how you can find out if a known sexual predator is living in your neighborhood.
The Girls in Boys Town National Hotline has put together a free brochure. More.
We now return for the conclusion of Predators Among Us. And now, Diane Sawyer.
We know now about Nathaniel Barjona, Wayne Chapman, and Michael Kelly, but what about the others released from the Massachusetts Treatment Center at the same time? The ones we don't know about. What neighborhoods do they live in? What are they doing? Cynthia McFadden has a final roll call.
During her last years at the treatment center, therapist Paula Erickson watched the parade of dangerous men being released.
I couldn't get anybody to investigate. The state police, the FBI, I could not get anyone.
So she compiled her own most wanted list. 26 men she was certain should never have been freed.
It gives me goosebumps today.
She was so concerned they would strike again that even though she no longer worked at the center, she took the 26 names to the state capitol.
I had the list in my hand to take it into the governor, and Kelly's name was at the top of the list when it came on the radio that they were looking for Michael Kelly in Jacksonville, Florida, for the murder of Deborah Levangie.
It was 1992. Paula Erickson held an impromptu press conference on the State House steps.
Something went wrong. I don't know what it is. But at any rate, we let Michael Kelly go.
Now, nearly 10 years later, therapy here at the treatment center is provided by an outside company. And many things here have changed, including the work release program, which has been eliminated. As for how many men were let go in the early 90s, we couldn't find anyone who could tell us. Not the Department of Corrections that runs the treatment center now, nor the Department of Mental Health that ran it then. So we took Paula Erickson's list and started searching because there's an even more important question. Where are these men now?
Of Erickson's 26 inmates, 1 is dead. 3 were released back to prison and could get out in the next few years. 11 of the 26 have been convicted of new crimes or are waiting for trial. That leaves 11 on Erickson's most wanted list. Where are they? We found 3 of the men near the treatment center in Brockton, a child molester and 2 rapists. And if you think that federal laws like Megan's Law means their neighbors know they are here, you are mistaken. More about that in a moment. So we're left with 8 men who are unaccounted for. One of them is this man, Vernon Shippey. We tracked him to Burlington, Vermont, and here he is, caught on a department store security camera. Among the clothing racks, he is exposing himself to a little girl.
Mr. Shippey was following them around different areas of the store, and when the mom's attention was on clothing or whatever it was she was looking at, Mr. Shippey was exposing himself to this little girl.
Detective Jim Claremont and Sergeant Mike Shearling say it's only one of several public places where Shippey exposed himself or molested children, including a waiting room at this hospital.
Mr. Shippey sat down on a bench next to a child, started to engage her in some conversation, reached over and touched her breast, and then exposed his penis and began to masturbate.
The behavior is shocking enough, but to do it in a public place.
Very unusual.
What does it say to you?
It's almost like a drug addiction, where they have to do this kind of behavior in order to satisfy their sexual desires.
So why was Shippey in the hospital waiting room? He was there with one of the mentally disabled adults he was caring for. That's right. After he got out of the treatment center, he got a job in Vermont working with people who couldn't care for themselves.
I mean, this is a vulnerable population.
Absolutely.
So before you hire someone, do you check them out?
Yes, we do.
Now a state senator, Jim Leddy, was then the head of the social service agency that hired Shippey. He tells us that when they had Shippey's criminal background checked in Vermont, it came up clean. And of course, Shippey himself revealed nothing.
There is a question on our form that clearly said, have you ever been convicted of any criminal charges, and if so, what? And he lied.
Said no.
He said no.
Leddy says that there was no way they could have found out that Shippey had been locked up in the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the sexually dangerous. That only came out after he was arrested and police ran his fingerprints. And what else did they discover?
Aggravated assault, robbery and escape, one burglary, grand larceny and burglary in possession of a stolen car, and burglary, interstate transportation of a stolen motor vehicle, possession of a revolver by a felon, some type of indecent acts with a child. That repeats again in 1974 and 1975.
And where did these crimes take place? All over the country.
Pennsylvania, Kansas, Illinois, Virginia, Louisiana, New Hampshire, New York, New Hampshire, New Hampshire, Connecticut, I missed that one, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Massachusetts, Massachusetts.
But since Shippey didn't have an arrest record in Vermont, none of this came out on his background check. And without fingerprints, which it would be illegal for most employers to use, no one would have learned the truth about Vernon Shippey. But what about the so-called Megan's Laws, adopted by all 50 states, requiring sex offenders to alert the community to their presence? Turns out there's no real coordination between states. California has registered almost 90,000 sex offenders. 28 states even have websites listing such criminals in their states.
We were wondering what was happening in Massachusetts, so we came here to find out. What could officials of the Massachusetts Sex Offender Registry Board tell us about those 26 men on Paula Erickson's list? We were shocked to discover that none of the 26 were registered. In addition, officials told us that while they believe there were 17,000 sex offenders in the state, only 40, that's right, 40, are registered.
We end as we began, in Montana, where Nathaniel Barjona was undetected until he was charged with an unspeakable crime. And his trail leading us back to the treatment center, where tonight there are 550 men housed. All have the right to petition for release. And if they do get out, will the rest of us have any idea where they go?
Is truly terrifying, and I think most parents have felt for a long time that Megan's Law would take care of it, that the tracking would be secure.
I think you're exactly right, Diane. In our experience in looking at these cases in Massachusetts, is that's not true.
One of the things that's most interesting is that Massachusetts, and I understand some other states, can keep sexual predators incarcerated past the end of their sentence. Is that fair, and is it legal?
Well, in 14 states it is legal, Charlie, and the way they do it is they say there's an underlying psychiatric condition which makes it permissible to extend the incarceration. So yes, it's legal in these states, and one other state besides Massachusetts, New Jersey, has a facility like the treatment center, a standalone psychiatric hospital to deal with these pedophiles.
All right, Cynthia McFadden, thanks.
And that's our program for tonight. I'm Diane Sawyer, wishing all of you a good night, and we'll see you in the morning.
I'm Charles Gibson.
What? Don't you get it?
Yeah, just one game. Oh, can you put me down at the end? See, my kids are here with a bunch of friends and, you know, some young girls.